That's the one I want, Grandpa. That one will catch a fish for sure. My younger son, 5 years old, was sitting beside his grandfather and me in the fishing tackle aisle of Canadian Tire, pointing up to a huge fishing lure prominently displayed on the end rack. The lure he was looking at was painted red and gold and a glittery metallic blue. It had 3 sets of lethally sharp triple-pronged hooks, and it must have weighed nearly half a pound. Grandpa, my father, thoughtfully appraised the massively inappropriate lure. Well, that's one heck of a piece of hardware. And I bet you it would be just the ticket if we were fishing for sharks. But the lakes we're going to be on next week, little short on shark. An awful lot of bass, though. Do you think a bass might be a little afraid of a lure that big? What about something more like this? My father held up a perfectly serviceable bass lure, maybe 2 inches long. But I have to say that when you're looking at, well, that's one heck of a piece of fishing tackle. Grandpa, what about these? My elder son, 10 years old, was standing at the other end of the fishing tackle aisle, tentatively holding up a box labeled Bass Buster Variety Pack. 100 lures, spinners, jigs, and baits guaranteed to drive bass wild. See, Grandpa? See, it's 100 lures, Grandpa. 100 lures, Grandpa, for only $10. Grandpa, that works out to only, well, Grandpa, that's only 10 cents a fish. My elder son's core personality, responsible, fiscally prudent, and a lifelong statistician, was clearly already shining through. But the lures in the Bass Buster Variety Pack, well, they were all small, drab, and nondescript. So even as his responsible brain held up the 100 lures, well, he couldn't help but look longingly to the other end of the aisle, where his little brother, whose life motto would always be, go big or go home, was now holding the box with the 10-inch monster lure. Well, the 2 grandsons eyed each other's choices in complete incomprehension, then turned to the arbiter of all things fishing in their world. What's better, Grandpa? The 100 small ones or the one big one? Well, let's get both. We can find out in the lake. And all parties headed to the checkout counter. Grandma and Grandpa, my mom and dad, were staying with Jennifer and me in Ottawa, planning a 3-generational canoe trip. And we really didn't need any more fishing lures. But over breakfast that morning, I had got to telling stories. Telling about the family canoe trips that I had when I grew up and how my father, on the day before the big trip, would take my little sister and me to Canadian Tire and give us each a $5 budget for fishing lures. Well, I must have told too compelling a tale. Because shortly after breakfast that morning, elder son approached the adults. So when are we going to Canadian Tire? To buy the fishing lures. It turned out that precedent had been established 25 years earlier. Well, I was about to protest. I was launching into an explanation that we already had more than adequate fishing tackle, and that I already had all that fishing tackle organized and color-coded by day and species and ready to go, and that any other lures would just mess with my organizational plan. When my father had sighed, shook his head, grabbed his car keys, and said, let's go get those lures now. Arriving at the Canadian Tire, I observed that historical precedent is subject to inflationary principle. Grandpa gave each of his grandsons a $10 budget for lures. Now, any of you who have ever traveled the myriad aisles of fishing tackle available in the local Canadian Tire will surely agree with me that of all the companies that prey on the hopes, the dreams, the desperate fantasies of consumers, then the fishing tackle companies are up there among the most shameless. I've personally come to the bitter conclusion through a lifetime of fishing that any correlation between what's promised on the package and of a fish actually biting the product is strictly coincidental. And after 2 days on our canoe trip, without so much as a solitary nibble from a fish, that was certainly the hard-won conclusion of two very disillusioned grandsons. In fact, the look on younger son's face transcended mere disappointment. Younger son was experiencing, for the very first time in his life, corporate betrayal. He had put his $10, well, Grandpa's $10, down in good faith, and now the 10-inch monster lure was failing to deliver as promised. Somehow that was wrong. Now, meanwhile, his big brother, the methodical boy, was hard at work on statistical analysis. There were 100 lures, spinners, jigs, and baits in the Bass Buster variety pack, and elder son determined that each one of those lures would be allotted precisely 5 casts into the lake before being declared an abject failure. So, though the process of disillusion took much longer to develop than it had in his little brother, that disillusion, ultimately reinforced by sound statistical data, proved to be even greater in the end. Finally, Grandpa was conscripted to catch a fish. Now, Grandpa hadn't been doing any fishing up until that point in the trip, but on the morning of day 3, the grandsons pressed him into action. Grandpa will catch a fish, elder son explained to his little brother, because Grandpa knows how. And so my father prepared his fishing rod, rigged it up, then turned to me. Not likely much chance you still have a particular lure in your tackle box, Jeff? Because I could sure use it now. I smiled, reached deep into the tackle box, and of course pulled out the Lucky Never Fail lure. I handed it to my dad. You don't think I would have allowed anything to happen to it, do you, Dad? Well, my father clipped the lure to a steel leader, spied the lake for a promising patch of weeds, and then, the faith of his grandsons on the line, Grandpa cast the Lucky Never Fail lure out into the waters. While the grandsons watched every moment of that lure's slow retrieval to the canoe with absolute confidence that a fish would bite. Neither of my sons believed in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny anymore, but they both believed in Grandpa. 5 meters from the canoe, the magic happened. Grandpa's line tip bent, line hummed out of the reel. The grandsons cheered. My father let out a whoop of joy, or possibly relief, and began to play the fish. And to my dad's credit, he milked that moment for everything it was worth, feigning a fierce battle. But he knew, and I soon realized watching, that the fish on the end of his line was absolutely no keeper. In fact, as my dad mimicked this epic fish retrieving battle, I began to secretly hope that the fish on the end of the line would spit out the lure before it made it to the canoe. I wanted to defer to another day the difficult decision of what you have to do with an undersized fish. But no such luck. My dad grabbed the net and the fish was landed in the boat. A tiny 10-inch pike, at least a full 2 years from maturity. My father shot me a questioning glance. If either of us were alone, this fish would have been back into the water right away. But the grandsons were cheering. Finally, somebody had caught a fish. I looked to my father, hoping that he would make the difficult call. But all I got back from my dad was a knowing, amused grin. Grandpas don't have to do the dirty work. That's what that grin said. So, I removed the hook from the fish's mouth, gave each of my sons a real live close-up look at a genuine fish out of the lake. Then I returned the baby pike to the waters. It recovered and was gone in a flash. But I looked up in time to see the flashes of disappointment in my own son's eyes. Finally somebody on this trip had caught a fish, and their own father had thrown it back into the lake instead of cooking it in a pan. Around the campfire that evening, elder son announced the math. There is, he said, only one fish in the lake. That fish is a pike. There is only one person on this trip who can catch that fish, Grandpa. And even when Grandpa catches the fish, Dad makes him put it back into the lake. So what is the point of fishing? Elder son abandoned his 100-piece Drives Bass Wild Lure collection and retreated to the more safe and reliable world of his hockey cards. But younger son soldiered on. If any child had a childlike faith, that child did. But he did make one change. In mute protest to my fish returning decision, younger son abandoned Jennifer and my canoe and took to spending his days sitting between Grandma and Grandpa in their canoe, where he continued to fish. Well, more accurately, where he continued to drag his 10-inch monster lure, really more anchor than bait, down the lake behind the grandparents' canoe. And while younger son fished, Grandpa entertained with fish stories, weaving tall tales of a secret lake, a lake he grew up on way north of Wawa, Ontario, where the fish were so hungry that if you weren't careful, the one you were reeling in would get eaten by a bigger one before you could get the first one to the boat. And so passed the lazy days of the family canoe trip, until the afternoon, when younger son turned to his grandfather. Grandpa, I think I have a fish. What do I do now, Grandpa? Well, my father knew that this was an impossibility. We were just motoring down the lake that day with a stiff tailwind at our back. And though younger son had lost track of his 10-inch monster lure about an hour earlier, Grandpa hadn't. Grandpa knew that that lure was not even submerged in the lake, but just skipping across the top of the waves. But younger son was insistent. Grandpa, I think I have got a fish. What do I do now? The grandparents stopped paddling. Well, keep your rod tip high, reel it in, I'll get the net ready just in case. Let's see what you've got. Well, younger son started to reel. And 2 minutes later, it came into view. The 10-inch monster lure, painted red and gold and glittery metallic blue with 3 sets of lethally sharp triple-pronged hooks. And there, dangling on the very end of the last of those hooks, snagged through the tail fin, was the most pissed-off sunfish that you have ever seen. Well, Grandpa pulled out the net, just for the theater of it, and the tiny little fish was summarily brought into the canoe. Now, ladies and gentlemen, marine biologists sometimes debate the cognitive capacity of our fishy friends. They ask pertinent scientific questions. Can they think? Do they feel? Do they have an inner life? Well, the answer, at least for that particular sunfish, on that particular day, is a resounding yes. Because as I stared into the pissed-off little annoyed eyes of that sunfish, there was no doubt that there was a very deep and rich inner life happening. Meanwhile, younger son was cheering, "I caught a fish, my very first fish!" And of course, he couldn't resist. My lure works. Yours don't. But immediately he fell silent and sad, recalling that just days earlier, his own father had thrown a much larger fish back into the lake. We can't keep him, can we, Grandpa? I looked to my father and once again realized this was going to have to be my call. Or so I thought. "Of course we are going to keep that fish," Jennifer's voice piped in from the back of the canoe. I've never tried sunfish before, but I bet it tastes delicious. And that one is fully grown for a sunfish? Then my mother chimed in. "Jennifer is absolutely right. It would be a positive crime and a shame to waste the sweet, delicate flesh of a fully grown sunfish. But sunfish is a species best cleaned and cooked immediately upon capture. Gentlemen, to the shore." And both canoes proceeded to the nearest shore. Well, Grandma and Grandpa had the cook fire blazing well before younger son and Jennifer returned from what for both of them was their very first foray into cleaning a tiny little fish. But eventually, and to great fanfare, younger son presented Grandma with 2 tiny little fillets of sunfish. And my mother, the culinary genius, went to work on her magic. Grandma took those tiny 2 little fillets. She dredged them in her own mixture of flour, salt, pepper, and just a hint of smoked paprika. Then she put the butter onto the pan, waiting for it to sizzle. Meanwhile, Grandpa grabbed the wanigan and brought out dishes, laid out 6 complete dinner settings. Plates, knives, forks, goblets for all. Grandma dropped the 2 little pieces of filet into the butter, kept them there for all of 10 seconds, flipped them once, pulled them out, and declared the sunfish done. And then Grandma went to work on the plating. She found a little hemlock tree, neatly cut a branch, then on the base of each plate placed a nice little bit of green hemlock. Grandpa, meanwhile, had obtained bright red bunchberries, which were judiciously arranged on top of the green hemlock. Then Grandma, from the food barrel, miracle of miracles, produced a real lemon. She sliced it into 6 perfect rings, twisted each ring into a Mobius strip, and placed the lemon ring delicately on top of the hemlock. Then came the delicate part, the 2 fillets of sunfish. Each of those fillets, Grandma cut into 3 perfectly equal portions, then delicately placed a bit of sunfish on the top of each lemon ring. A generous grind of pepper, a pinch of salt, and Grandma declared dinner ready. When I was growing up, my mother talked to me a lot about food. Plating always matters, Jeff, she told me, but particularly when the featured protein is in short supply. Well, the family gathered round. Then my parents looked at me, expecting me to say grace. I did my best. Thank you, Creator, for the abundant bounty that you provide. And then the family tucked into the feast. Grandma, authority on all matters culinary, declared the sunfish to be perfect in all respects, on point. My dad proposed a toast with orange tang to younger son, the founder of the feast. Then the wanigan was packed, the canoes were loaded, and the family headed on down the lake. But from that day forward, younger son no longer required his grandfather's touch to catch a fish. Younger son had his own magic now. A 10-inch monster lure painted red and gold and glittery metallic blue with 3 sets of lethally sharp triple-pronged hooks. And who knows? Someday, maybe, he'll pass that lure on to his kids. There are, after all, plenty of sunfish still out there in the lake, having perfectly sunny days, just waiting to be snagged through the tail fin.